You're listening to Cinema Rex, a podcast about Iranian films. Episode 1, Abbas Kiarostami's Where is the Friend's House? How did we say we start this? Durud Bishoma? Dustana Aziz?
I guess either Durud Bar Shoma or Dustana Aziz, dear friends. One or the other.
Let's just go with both for this one.
Okay, sure. That works.
Durud Bar Shoma, Dustana Aziz. Welcome to the Cinema Rex podcast. My name is Kaveh Mohebbi.
And I'm Faran Moradi.
And we're two filmmakers from Canada, Iranian filmmakers who have decided to start a podcast on Iranian cinema. Why have we decided to do this?
Well, you mentioned to me that there wasn't one when you were looking into podcasts, and it seemed like a bit of a gap.
It seemed like there was a lot of people who started started podcasts on Iranian cinema, but got like one episode in, and then they would stop. Like it was like their last and only episode was in 2015. And so I think if we just get one episode, if we get 2 episodes down, we're already killing it.
We're number 1.
Yeah, exactly. And for the very first episode, we're going to be doing 1987 Abbas Kiarostami's Where is the Friend's House? A film that I think not only gets a lot of celebrated attention, rightfully so, but it's one of the few films that really encompasses the idea of Iranian cinema, and amongst Kiarostami's work is one of those few standouts, not few, but one of the many standouts in his collection, in his works. How do you feel about this specific film?
Overall, I like it a lot. The film is set in, I think, Gilan, like the province,
Right.
which linguistically it borders Azeri and Mazandarani, which are the two sides of my family. I don't know if it geographically does, but linguistically at least, it's close to both of those languages. So there's parts in the movie that the accents, or when they switch to languages specific to the village, they're definitely nostalgic for me, either because I grew up around relatives who spoke those languages, or, you know, I would watch VHS tapes that were sent from Iran where our family would have recorded video messages for us and we would watch those. So in a lot of ways, it feels nostalgic. You're almost watching a slice of life from your family.
Yeah, so like it feels personal to you almost, or like it feels like something. It feels like home in a sense. I guess, for you.
Yeah.
You were born and raised there. What? How old were you when you moved to Canada?
No, I was born and raised here. Yeah, born and raised here. So that's why it's even weirder that to me it feels nostalgic. But yeah,
You visited though.
I've never visited either.
It's like a nostalgia for a place you've never been.
Exactly, which is a weird feeling to have, especially, and I'm sure you've experienced this to some degree, and a lot of the listeners probably also. It's this weird feeling of knowing that you're Canadian, right? And that you're born and raised here. You know the language. I know the history and the politics of Canada really well. I can speak French and English fluently, but always feeling like I'm not from here. People will sometimes make comments or approach dialogue in a way that makes me feel like I'm not from here.
Right.
Despite the fact that I've never been to Iran either. And sometimes I'll meet Iranians who comment on my accent when I speak Farsi. But growing up with, you know, we would have phone calls with my grandparents or my aunts and uncles and my cousins, and receiving videotapes from my dais, my khale, my ammus, my ammes. They would send them, and you would sit there and your parents would pop in this VHS tape. And at the time I was like, oh, this isn't a big deal, whatever, because you're like 5 or 6. But they would be overwhelmed with emotions watching these videos. Because they would go to like this village where like one family member lives. They'd go to the city. They'd go to somebody's house, someone's apartment, and they'd just be recording little bits and pieces of people living their lives. And you would get this insight into family dynamics in Iran, which I feel like this film does that in a lot of ways, where it doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily feel like a fictional film, and it just feels like you're watching the lives of these people in Gilan.
Yeah, and I think we should also start by saying that you are a film director, and I'm a writer, I'm a screenwriter, and we both are actually, luckily enough, or through the force of sheer will, we've managed to carve careers for ourselves in this industry. But I think what will be really interesting throughout the rest of this podcast is you approach a lot of these films paying close attention to the cinematic language, the use of photography, cinematography, colors. I feel like you have that innate skill embedded in you, and I'm more, maybe not more so than you, but I definitely know that my personal talents really rely more on character and structure. And in Iranian films, like you were just saying, a lot of them don't really rely that much on structure. It's very slice of life and very much like documentary style, even when it is narrative fiction. And that makes it an interesting watch for me because it kind of feels like Iranian films do something that no other cinema does. It's just kind of like the line between reality and narrative is so razor thin, razor sharp, that you don't know what you're watching often. And I feel like that's the case. Well, for this, you can definitely tell there's a narrative story, but this is the first of the Kokar trilogy, and as you see in the rest of the films that he does in this trilogy, it becomes more and more documentary style. Like he starts becoming the story, about the making of the story, which is just fascinating. And I think we're going to have a lot of interesting discussions throughout the rest of these podcasts about just our different approaches on what it meant to us and how we respond to it.
With this film too, also coming back to mentioning I'm a director, you're a writer. There were a couple comments made in the Q&A that's included in the Criterion Blu-ray where someone was like, did this movie have a script? And Kiarostami starts laughing and he's like, well, of course it had a script. But the fact that you asked me that is a massive compliment as a writer. Yeah. That you thought that this was just, I just walked around with a camera and filmed people. And then he shares this anecdote of him being in the airport the day after the movie screened on television in Iran, and people getting into an argument and kind of laughing about what he did on the film, because someone was like, oh, I saw your movie, blah, 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 blah. And someone gets into an argument with that guy. And it turns out that guy thought that the movie didn't have a director. He just assumed that someone was walking around with a camera, like capturing the stuff. So, so this idea of it feeling like a slice of life, I think is a lot of people share that sentiment. I'm excited as we get into the podcast and talk about it more, to talk about how much of the things shown in the film are meant to be allegory and symbolism, and how much of it was just like, no, that's just very literal. But we can talk about that later, because I'm excited to talk about that.
Great. Now I'd like to play for you a small excerpt from Criterion's interview with Michael Cera on Where is the Friend's House.
You've confessed that you're a Kiarostami fan.
Yeah.
What led you to Where's the Friend's House?
That one has had such an impact on me. The first thing you see in the movie is this teacher really upsetting these kids, just making them feel like they're horrible people, just because they've basically been talking and having fun when he wasn't in the room, and they haven't done their homework, and they'll have no future, and they're going to be expelled if they don't do it. And the kid's just cowering and terrified. You're immediately entranced. And then you see this kid cry, in like the first minute of the movie. It's an incredible way to get you to invest in something by making your sympathy register just go through the roof right away, which is the whole charge of the story of the movie, is seeing this kid feel sympathy for the other kid. This is kind of like his 400 blows, like it might be directly from his childhood. It gives you a sense of what it's like to be a little kid in Iran and how impossible that is. I mean, that's basically the story. It's completely realistic, and somehow within that takes on this kind of magical realism.
Well, with that, if you'll allow me, I'll dive into a quick plot summary, just so that anyone who has maybe never seen the film might listen to this podcast and either be interested in watching it or at least know what we're talking about. But for those who have seen this film, maybe they haven't seen it recently, just a little bit of a refresher. So with your permission. As the film opens, a young grade schooler named Ahmed, played by Babak Amirpour, watches as his teacher berates a fellow student, Mohammad Reza, for repeatedly failing to use his notebook for his homework, threatening expulsion on the next offense. When Ahmed returns home, he realizes he's accidentally taken Mohammad Reza's notebook. To prevent his friend from being expelled and against his mother's orders, Ahmed sets out on a journey zigzagging across the neighboring villages of Pushte and Koker in search for Mohammad Reza's house, encountering false leads, dead ends, and distractions as he attempts to enlist adults in his search, most of whom ignore him or cannot answer his questions. His quest becomes both a revealing portrait of rural Iranian society in all its richness and complexity, and a touching parable about the meaning of personal responsibility. This film was Kiarostami's first film to gain major international attention. It won the Bronze Leopard at the 1989 Locarno Film Festival and the Golden Plate at the Fajr Film Festival. The film is on the BFI's list of 50 films to see by the age of 15. It has a Rotten Tomato score of 100% and an audience score of 92%. Faran, what are your thoughts on those reviews and those remarks already?
I had no idea that the Rotten Tomato score was so high. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's more surprising to me because it is a slice of life story. It's shocking to me how critically acclaimed it is. And I'm not saying it's not deserved. I'm just saying oftentimes movies that are critically acclaimed are movies that, you know, they end very obscurely and it ends in tragedy, and there's all these conversations and discussions and philosophical debates and all this stuff. But the fact that this slice of life film thrusts this guy into international stardom, I think is really fascinating. And I think it's reflective of the multifaceted interests of audiences.
Yeah, and I think, and we'll get to it when we sort of talk about critical reception and some trivia facts, but I think it really opened up, maybe for the first time internationally, Iranians to the type of poetic sentiments they have. Like, Iranians have always been known for being wonderful poets, and yes, there had been previous films like The Cow, but I think for the first time, Kiarostami sort of like shook the world in the poetic cinematic language that Iran is capable of, not just in the writing, but in terms of the landscapes and the use of, you know, he thrives off showing these small villages. That's where he's like comfortable, and he finds such profound beauty in these small villages and within some of the poorest people in the country. And I think that is what kind of touched at least the festival crowd. You know, it might have not have been like the popcorn Michael Bay, like go see a movie on Saturday night at the theater, but it was definitely like a festival film. And I think that's sort of what like instantly sparked attraction to him and other Iranian filmmakers. Can I ask you a question though? One thing that's always bugged me, why is it called Where is the Friend's House? Because I've always thought of it like it's grammatically incorrect. Like, it's just where is my friend's house? But I feel like somewhere through translation, where is the friend's house became the most popularized version of the translation. And it seems almost too literal.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on that?
I wouldn't be surprised if it's like a self-indulgent artsy fartsy translator trying to make it sound as artistic as possible.
Yeah, okay.
Because I think it's actually meant to be from the perspective of the mom asking the kid.
Oh,
because she's the one that, like, if you go by the Farsi title, she's the one that utters that line. So if you were to translate it more accurately, it would actually be, where is your friend's house? Right?
But then why isn't it where is your friend's house?
There must be some reasoning behind, like, oh, this sounds like it's a different kind of movie from what it is, and blah, 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 blah. So that's my guess. I find a lot of Iranian cinema is overly dissected to the point where people are making inferences where there aren't necessarily any to be made. Sometimes things are meant to be literal and straightforward and just like, no, that's the way it is. That's life, right? And that is reflected, I think, in this idea of this being a slice of life film. Or how a lot of these Iranian filmmakers the motif that they explore is the motif of perspective. Like this whole film, you can make the argument that it's all about perspective. The perspective of children, the perspective that children have on other kids, children have on their parents, children have on the elderly, as well as parents on children, parents on the elderly, elderly on grandchildren. But listening to the Q&As, people keep asking them like, oh, what is the symbolism behind this? Or what is the symbolism behind that? And a lot of these critics make comments, or festival programmers make comments where they're trying to make these deep connections and maybe these deep inferences where they're not necessarily there. So I don't know. That's just a thought.
I mean, yeah, I also feel like that's just sort of the subject. That's the nature of filmmaking or any art, really, because there's something I'm going to bring up later with his fascination with doors, which I find so weird and interesting. And, you know, it can't just be he likes the way doors look. I mean, there obviously he does like the art behind doors, but he really, really centers a lot of his career around the framing of doors in cinema, and also in like photographing doors. And there's, you could just look at it and be like, well, he likes doors, but there's also some fun in playing with the poetic nature of what that represents.
Did you see his answer to the question that someone posed to him about doors?
Which one?
Do you want to? We can save it for trivia, or like when you want to talk about that later.
Sure.
Because someone asks him directly, like, is there a meaning behind how much importance you put around doors, like photographs in this movie, blah, 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 and he talks about it.
What does he say?
He says that it's a total coincidence.
Okay.
And that it's not meant to be symbolic. He didn't necessarily always have a meaning behind the use of a door, especially in regards to this film. He says, but then he goes on to give a philosophical answer and says that doors are always super important and there's practical purposes to all of them. We don't even realize how important they are in our day-to-day lives, and every door tells a story. There's a history behind it, its use, who built it, when it was made, what materials it was made from, etc. But that wasn't his intention. He only gets into this philosophical side of things because this guy asks him the question and he's like, oh, that's really interesting. He's like, that wasn't my intention. I was just trying to show doors for like a literal use in those situations. Right?
Right. And when we get to the digging deeper section, I will return to that, because I feel like even just the old man that he meets is obsessed with talking about doors and windows.
Yeah.
You know, Ahmed's walking around and this guy is like a door maker and a window maker. So it's not just he's taking photos of doors. It's like he's embedded it within the characters he's creating in the film. Mm-hmm. And the guy
that he follows on the donkey, that guy's a door maker.
Exactly. Like it's a motif throughout the script.
The door at the beginning in the classroom that keeps opening and closing.
It's the opening shot. It's the first shot of the film.
But he says, and he like affirms this, that it's a total coincidence, that he didn't have any symbolic meaning behind it, at least with this film in particular. And that he thought it was an interesting question that was posed by the guy in the audience. And I think that he was gracious enough to indulge in the metaphors with him. I think with his photo series, it's a little different.
Right.
But specifically with this movie, he says that it's coincidental.
Well, the great thing about cinema is once he puts the film out there, it's up for everyone's interpretation.
Yeah, it's no longer his film.
Who is Kiarostami to tell Kaveh Mohebbi what Kiarostami's film is about?
But that's what I mean, is like, that's why I love talking about Iranian cinema, is because oftentimes people will watch things and be like, wow, what is the meaning behind it? And sometimes it's like, there's no meaning, it's just a door. But then when you ask the guy who made the thing, he's like, oh, that's actually a really interesting thought. Like, let's talk about it. And then he talks about like, then he gives a very poetic answer, which was a beautiful answer. But I just think that conversation encapsulates Kiarostami's place in cinema to me.
Right. Well, let me ask you about this then. With Kiarostami and a lot of other Iranian filmmakers, they often work with children, but they're not necessarily making children's films.
Yeah.
Like, Where's the Friend's House isn't necessarily like, oh, you sit down with a bunch of 6-year-olds and watch this movie. It's a film for adults, right? Mm-hmm. But they're either featuring a lot of them feature children protagonists, and is it about the sense of adventure and discovery and innocence that exists within a kid, or is it because like he was able to find kids? Like what do you think his fascination is with casting children in films? Because he does it quite often.
So I can't speak for Kiarostami, but I like working with children because children have a much more direct way of looking at life. Like things are either black or they're white, they're right or they're wrong. They don't necessarily see the nuance in things. And I think that it's a really great way to showcase the innocence of a character without showing them as naive. Because if you have an adult character who sees the world as that, typically they're naive. But a child, you kind of grant them a little bit of grace in that area, which I think thematically is really great.
Have you had experience working with children as a director?
Yeah. So Tehranto very minimally, but I made a short film called Black Powder and Guilt. And Black Powder and Guilt was all about innocence lost and this young child who witnesses a traumatic event happen to his younger brother that leads to him having lifelong trauma. And the film is all about discovering exactly what happened and why he feels personally responsible for that.
Wow, okay. How old was the kid?
I think they were like 12 and 10. I could be wrong. I think they were like 12 and 10.
So you probably resonate with Kiarostami on that idea of working with kid actors and finding that nuance.
I think so, yeah. And I've also directed a lot of kids TV. And again,
right,
with kids TV, it's the same idea that when you're working with these children, if you treat them with respect and you treat them with dignity and you actually listen to what they have to say as opposed to ignoring what they're doing, even when they're goofing around, like if you just ignore them and you're like, guys, can we focus? Like that doesn't resonate well with them because they're like, oh, this guy doesn't respect my time. He doesn't respect who I am as a person. And sometimes children will fall in line with what that director's saying out of fear. And having worked as an editor on kids' TV, you can see how children react to different kinds of directing. And in some cases, directors will do things to try to trick an actor to do what they want. And in other cases, they'll actually work intimately with that kid and be like, okay, how do you want to do this? Like, what do you think the character's thinking here? You're really working with them. Even your body language, where some directors might come in and they'll kneel or they'll lean over to talk to a kid to get on the same height level, is very patronizing to a child. And I don't think people realize that. But if you're speaking to this child as a professional, they're on that set same as everybody else. They're putting in the hours to memorize the lines. They're getting up early. They're coming to work. If you stand and they're standing and you're just talking to each other as professionals, you'll get way better performances.
Yeah, I read once somewhere that Kiarostami was a teacher before he worked in advertising, and advertising before he was a filmmaker. But then after that, I couldn't find anywhere corroborating the fact that he was a teacher. So I'm not entirely sure that's correct. But he has a clear fascination with not only students but teaching and the education system. Because there's a companion documentary he made to this film called Homework, which I watched for this podcast, and it's just a series of interviews with children about why or why not they hadn't done their homework. But then he did another short film called A Tribute to Teachers, and he's just fascinated with Iranian society and its education system. And his directorial style was often described as, quote, a patient teacher in a room full of earnest but slow learners. So I feel like he just had this sort of, he had the makings of a director that would be very patient with young actors, even if at times it would be sort of manipulative in an artistic sense. I mean, with that, we could sort of go into our behind the scenes section of the podcast. You were telling me earlier about one of the stories about how his directing style was with the kid in the opening scene.
Yeah, so people have asked him because he's known for tricking his actors and manipulating their emotions to try to get whatever response he wants on camera. And with that, with the little boy who doesn't do his work, what he was doing was throughout that day, there was another person on set who was taking photographs with a Polaroid camera. And this little boy never had a photo of himself. And so a few times, Kiarostami, to like set up this thing, kept being like, you don't get to have a photo. Other people can, but you can't. You're not allowed. And he tells him 3 times. And then finally the guy with the Polaroid takes a photo of him, and then he tries to hide it. And then Kiarostami confiscates the photo of him. And this kid apparently loved this photo. It was his favorite photo because he had never had a photo before, and he rips it up in front of him, and then the kid starts crying. And then with the camera rolling, that's the shot. Yeah. And he as he's rolling on him, he's like, how many times did I tell you that you don't get to have a photo?
Right.
Huh? And then he's like crying and he's sobbing. He's like, how many times did I tell you?
Yeah.
And then he's like, 3 times. He's like, that's right. I told you 3 times that you don't get to have a photo.
And that's the dialogue.
And that's the dialogue. So the dialogue in the movie is, how many times have you not done your homework? And he just responds 3 times. Yeah. And to me, I don't like it. I think it's very cheap.
Just dark.
It's dark. And he says that's the only way to get them to feel it and not just pretend. And I hate that, because to me, it comes back to this thesis of conformity pays, which is kind of hinted at in the film when the old man or the grandfather is telling this wise story to his buddies. He's like, yeah, I knew this guy who got paid half as much as a foreign engineer, because the foreign engineer only needed to be told something once, so he got 12,000 toman. But because this Iranian engineer needed to be told multiple times, he only got paid half as much. It's like, so conformity pays, like, you do as you're told, whatever. Right. And to me, it comes back to that, because it's like, you don't need to do these weird things to get a result.
Right.
It's BS. And I think that to me, that was the point of that scene, is he's trying to show, sometimes people think they're so wise and they come up with these weird anecdotes to make a point, and it doesn't need to be done. And I think that's the same thing here. I think real actors, talented actors, you need to trust them to be able to do that themselves. Some actors will draw from their own experiences, but that's not on us as directors to trick them into doing. And I don't think that any work of art is worth imparting some sort of trauma on somebody. So that's something that I'm really disappointed by.
I, for one, am a huge proponent of emotional abuse on children, as long as it gets the performance out of them. God damn it. I'm obviously awesome. Kidding. The one little interesting behind the scenes fact I was able to pull was first of all, I love the final image in the movie, the flower. The first time I'd seen it, I was like, oh, that's really beautiful. And I don't know why. It's touching. It really kind of gets to me, and I couldn't figure out why. And hearing in that same interview, he discusses that it was never planned to be the final image. He was struggling on what the final image of the film should be. And then when doing so, he remembered earlier having shot a scene where the old man hands the kid a flower, and he's like, hey, if my tracking of the story is correct, that flower should still be in his book. So they quickly found another flower, placed it in the book, and pressed it in the pages. And and sure enough, he was like, this is the final image. So I really like the idea that this was never like a planned final shot. It was just something it really speaks to like the chaotic and beautiful nature of kind of filmmaking on the spot.
That's cool.
Never in the script.
Because what I was hearing is actually a little different than what you heard.
What did you hear?
The story that I heard was that when he was writing the script, he pulled that from an experience that he had with someone where he was having troubles, and someone like picked a flower and gave it to him and was like, keep this with you. It'll make you feel better, blah, 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 blah. And he thought that it was just a really sweet thing that someone had done with him. So he wrote it into the script because he was trying to make the script longer. He was like looking for things to put in, because he previously preferred to do short films until your family friend, the producer, was like,
Batman Farman.
Yeah. He was like, why don't you make a feature film? Right, and make more feature films. And so he was looking for things to make it longer. So he wrote in this experience that he had with the flower. But then when they went to shoot that last scene, he forgot to put the flower back in the book.
Oh,
And so
I see.
as they're filming the scene, they were already rolling on it. He yells out like from behind the camera. He's like, "Avoy!" Like, "Oh no!" Like, "Oh man!" Like he forgot to put the flower in. And then they're
Okay,
like,
right,
they were about to stop the take, and they're like, "Whoa, what's wrong?" And he's like, "Nothing. Just keep going." And then as the kid is going through it, he flips through to that page, and sure enough, the flower was still there. And just by like pure chance, like he had forgotten that they needed to go back and put that in, but by pure chance, it was still there from when they had filmed the other scene where the old man puts
you know
it
what?
in.
That is also I'd heard that version too, that the serendipitous nature. But I think maybe the story I remember hearing then it was during the writing phase though that he had remembered, because I think it was about the idea of like not knowing how to end it maybe at the script stage and realizing going back in his mind of the scenes.
Oh yeah, maybe.
But yeah, like that. I just really love that final image, and I think it's
beautiful.
It's probably one of the most beautiful. It's in there like top 10 for me, top 5 maybe even for final like images.
Oh, nice.
I think of this as a screenwriter. Like I'm always about like when I put the scripts, I'm like, what's the first thing we see and what's the last thing we're left with? And I always like to bookend those some way. And I don't think these necessarily parallel each other, but I think there's a very purposeful use of a door, half-shut door being the first image, and a flower in a book. You know, it's they're not really paralleling each other. They're not really like, you know, mirror opposites, but they sort of, I think they're just so purposeful, and they say something. Whether that's beauty and freedom versus the school's locked doors or whatever. There's something there.
Coincidentally, someone also asks him about the symbolism behind the flower. And again, he says, "Oh, nothing. It was just something cool that happened to me. And I thought it would be a nice little detail to put in the story to make the story longer."
You know, there's a good chance, too, that true artists like Kiarostami have to give those answers. Because if they sit there and start explaining everything one by one, they're kind of like revealing the magic trick.
Maybe.
But yeah, do you find as a filmmaker that people, you know, pull out things that you never meant to put in there? And conversely, have you ever found that you've put something in there very deliberately and maybe people haven't noticed? Like
Constantly.
That specific intention.
Constantly.
Right.
And it's like, it's frustrating when you put something in and nobody notices it sometimes. Sometimes you put a little Easter egg in and someone notices it and you're like, like it was so worth it. Like I've put in like memes into things before in the background and like had one person out of like thousands come up to me like, "Hey, you know that scene in Toronto where like he's calling to the kitchen and like they start singing and dancing off camera?" It's like, yeah. They're like, "Is that a reference to this one meme?" I was like, "Yeah." I'm like so happy.
Which meme is it a reference to?
There's this Agha Farshid meme. It's like a prank call.
Okay,
it's from Iran. I'll send it to you. It's pretty funny.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I don't know it.
But then sometimes people will be like, "Oh, when you do this thing and this happens, like, it's about this, right?" And then it's like, well, that's not what I intended, but that's a really great, you know, inference to make. And then having that conversation, which I will say, because he's very poetic as a person, when people point these things out, he engages in that dialogue. He engages in that conversation where he's like, you know, the story behind why that happened is very literal. But now that you mention it, which I think is really great of him to do, instead of just being on that stage and being like, "Yeah, no, that wasn't my intention. Next question." He's like, "You know, I didn't mean that, but now that you mention it, let's talk about that." I think that is a very gracious way to tackle that, and it shows that he has a poetic nature about him.
So, okay, speaking about the poetic nature, let's go to the section I'd like to call deeper analysis, like the themes and subtext of the film. What do you, like, thematically think? What would you say this film is about? Because I have a bunch of, like, I'm like the high school kid who wrote, like, 3 different answers instead of giving one thorough answer. I'm like, it's also this and this and this. I have a bunch of things that I'm fascinated with, but I'd like you to start or take it away of like the themes you think he's interested in exploring in this film.
Yeah, I think that stripped down to its core, a big part of the movie is about perspectives. So perspective of the kids, perspective of the parents, of the elderly. I I think the idea that conformity pays is...
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, because every time this kid is like trying to get his point across, everybody's like, no, you sit down and you do what you have, like what I'm telling you to do. Otherwise, you're going to get, they're ignoring him. Or he gets like something thrown at him. He gets like threatened that he's going to get hit in the head. He gets, there's this threat of expulsion for the one kid, right? But he knows that sometimes doing what's truly right comes at that personal cost. I think also learning how to speak with someone with dignity. There's themes of ageism there, of responsibility, of community. Yeah, that's kind of the crux of it for me is this idea of perspective and dignity.
Yeah, I see the perspective and dignity a lot. I don't see the conformity one as much, which is why I find your analysis really interesting. My main takeaway, can I lay this on you?
Yeah,
Ready?
absolutely.
I think it's about kindness and the value of empathy and the importance of personal responsibility. Because I think with like using the child actors and the innocence that children have, like it touches even a lot of the most cynical adults and it like resonates with them. And I think this idea of if you like, I did the math and he was like 47 when he made this film. He's almost 50. And there's a whole other thing about I'll get into about like the passage of time and the, modernization versus tradition with the Doors. But I think when you talk about like the journey that this kid is on, and the journey that a lot of his characters are on through many of his films, they often end actually pretty sad. And life goes on, ends with you don't know if he's going to find the kids. In A Taste of Cherry, you don't really. It's like this guy's on a journey to commit suicide, and you don't really know how that's going to end. It's not always a satisfying ending, but with this, it's like very clear that after he fails to find his friend and his friend's house, he decides to stay up all night and do his friend's homework for him, and culminating in this act of like he's sitting there and like even the wind is blowing so hard it knocks the door open, yet another door, and it's this happy ending, which is really rare for him, and I feel like it's his celebration of moral integrity and being good to one another. There's something about the kid is doing the homework at the end, and essentially Ahmed is committing a revolutionary act. It's not really clear in the final scene what he's doing, but nature erupts against this. It's trying to corrupt this kid's act. Again, I'm getting too poetic with it, but I feel like in the end, it's celebrating friendship, fidelity, commitment, independence, generosity, and it's like standing in defiance of nature. Something about and ending on that flower. It's I think he's profoundly interested in people doing good for one another and essentially just being bros, man. It's like. Or being humans to one another. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Like, do you not find kindness and empathy being such a major factor in this story?
No, I think so, absolutely. And I think that's kind of why for me it comes back to speaking to one another with dignity. Is that same thing of also treating people with kindness and having empathy towards other people, and when it tackles things like ageism and the weight of responsibility and community, I think, again, it ties back into what you were saying about kindness and empathy. One thing that I find interesting is that someone points out, and this is kind of the same feeling that I got from the film, was this idea that children are often neglected by adults and they're often not taken seriously, and adults don't listen to children. While ironically, when the kids are around elderly, like people who are like old and sick or old and frail, old and weak, now he's being a jerk to them. He's like, no, just come. And that old lady's like, no, I'm sick. He's like, yeah, just come. Or like the old guy who's like, I'm coming as fast as I can. He's like, look, you're going slow again. Like it's... Yeah,
you're too slow. Yeah. He's like, because when I talk, I slow down. He's like, well, then don't talk.
Yeah,
just keep moving.
Yeah. So someone asks him, and then he's like, he ends up quoting Balzac, where he says, as a child, parents don't listen to us, and as parents, our children don't listen to us. And then he says that in his estimation, it's children who don't listen more often. And he says that his film is meant to show that children don't listen more often, which was surprising to me. Because for me, it's like, oh, clearly this whole movie could have been resolved if parents listened to him.
Just listen.
But I think
Yeah,
he
I
makes
agree
the
with you.
counterpoint that, well, if he just listened to his parents, then it's not on him. That kid might get in trouble, but that's whatever. Like,
Yeah.
that's just the way it is. You got to prioritize what your parents are like. No, in the long run, your studies are what's important. Sit here and do your studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think? I mean, we touched on the flower a little bit, but the one thing I was going to add was the flower that is in the book. Forget about the directing for a second. It's like in the world of the film, the Ahmed doesn't even know the flower. Like, he doesn't remember the flowers in there. He didn't put it there as a message, right? And we don't see his friend Mohammad Reza, the kid who's in trouble. We don't even really see him react to it. So it's almost like a flower that's just sitting there for the audience to see. And what I took from that in this deeper analysis section is that it's like the flower is a gift Kiarostami is giving the boys, or at least Ahmed, as like he's celebrating and rewarding Ahmed's kindness in an otherwise cruel and indifferent world. Like, there's something about the flower just existing there, and it's not a thing that anyone reacts to or says like this is like, it's just kind of there. And it's just like a gift from the director, or maybe from fate, based on the story you were saying that it just happened to be there. But that's one of the things I really like about the flower too, is kind of like a little bit of touch of sweetness at the end of like, good job. You stood by one another.
That's actually really
Which I
beautiful.
like. Yeah, I love that. I love that aspect of what he does, those little touches. Also, I will say, okay, let's just take a quick detour and like disagree violently about the doors and windows.
Okay.
Because I think it's such a strange obsession he has.
Yeah.
His 2015 photography series was called Doors Without Keys, right?
Yeah. And
which is at Aga Khan.
He that's what he was partially there to promote when he does his Q&A, where he denies the door thing.
Yeah. But I don't... Like, so do you agree with it? Do you believe that a door is just a door? Because to me, I'm like, but they're everywhere and they're beautiful, and he pays so much attention to them.
Maybe doors are to Kiarostami as feet are to Tarantino. You know
Tarantino?
what I mean? Maybe
he's got a door fetish?
Yeah, maybe in his earlier days, he didn't realize that he had such a fascination with doors.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it was intentional, like, oh, this door is symbolic for, the entryway to someone's soul and blah, 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 blah. I think he was just like, oh, I need to have two characters that show the difference of generations. Someone who knows everybody and is connected to everybody and built their cribs, was there since they were babies and continues to know who everybody is, built something, right, that was important to everybody's life. And then now we have this younger character, this adult, he's not an elderly, he's not a child. It's simply put, the generation that is running things now comes out and is like, no, we need to replace all these old things with this new thing, with this modern thing. I think the choice of the door could have been replaced by like almost anything. Like, you could have made the argument that like, oh, maybe he was a roofer, right? Maybe it's about fences. Maybe it's about plumbing, whatever. But the fact that he specifically picks door, I think, is more reflective of him as an individual, Kiarostami as an individual, having a fascination on doors, as opposed to picking the door because it means X, Y, Z. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I mean, but here's the thing, Faran. With everything in filmmaking being deliberate, he didn't pick fences or roofs. He did pick doors.
Yeah.
And again, going back to the opening shot, it's like he made a very deliberate. The first thing we see in this film is the door,
and it holds on it for a while.
And he holds on it for a while. And actually, there's a very I could go into like doors being it's the front to your property. It's a sense of security, a closed door in your home. Everything kind of comes back to the sense of safety and personal. And if you look at this door that's like on its hinges, it's barely opening and closing. This school door, it's not quite open, it's not quite closed. You know that he's obsessed with students and the education system. There's an argument that can be made, if we're in the deeper analysis section, that it's like, is he saying something about the confines of the school system and how he literally has the opening credits, and it goes, "The Institute for the Intellectual Development of Children presents." That's in the opening credits.
Yeah.
Saying that over the door, almost ironically, over this door, and it's like it feels claustrophobic. Like you hear these kids playing whatever, and then the teacher comes in, and he's such an asshole. Like that teacher comes in and he starts berating all of them. No, I love him. He's so mean.
He's like, I don't know if he's mean. To me, he's like the stereotypical Iranian dad.
Exactly. No, he is stereotypical. It's a product of the time and place, but still, it's also like he berates the kids, and then Mohammad Reza says to the teacher, "I didn't bring my notebook," and the teacher's like, "Well, where is it?" He's like, "I left it with my cousin." And then the other student goes, "I have your notebook." And he's like, "So you were lying to me right now when you said it was the cousin?" He goes, "No, that is my cousin."
Yeah.
And then the teacher changes the subject because he's like kind of embarrassed himself.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like he's like, it's just it's a weird critique on like, I feel like he has such a fascination with students and kids.
Can I
and
share
it's like in defense of these kids, like they're, I don't know.
I share a personal anecdote with you? My
Please
first time watching this movie was with my mom, who was a teacher in rural Iran. That was her job. And she was born and raised in a city. She spent a lot of time in rural areas where my grandfather had a bit of land. But when she went and started working as a teacher, it was in these rural areas. And especially as a woman, like you have to be able to pick up on when kids are goofing around and when they're trying to pull a fast one on you. So you have to kind of be able to like call kids out on everything, right?
Right.
Even if they're when you realize it's like, oh, okay, he's not goofing around. That is his cousin, blah, 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 blah. And you can't linger on it because if you do, the kids are going to pick up on it and roast you for it.
But those kids seem so sweet. And he frames them to look. You know that one kid who complains he has a back pain?
Yeah.
He's got such beautiful blue eyes.
Yeah.
He's such a, like, they're so cute. I get it, but he's not framing these kids.
He doesn't have back pain.
I know, but he frames these kids to look so sweet and like helpless and innocent. He's not framing them to be like a bunch of goofballs, messing around.
I would make the argument that that's largely because the teacher is the way that he is. Because the teacher is the way that he is, everybody is
doing
like,
a good job.
Yeah. If he doesn't, if he gave them an inch, I guarantee you those kids would take a mile. Look, the second they leave the school, they're like climbing all over this plow that's outside the class, and they're like goofing around with like the chickens and the donkeys and stuff. They're like, one kid runs by and like slaps 3 of his friends in the face and runs away. Like,
yeah, they're 8. They're 8 years old. It's what kids do. I give them a pass. But then, okay, the last thing I'll say about doors is we've talked about this, the door salesman. Mm-hmm. And he's like trying to upsell these new doors to the townsfolk, right? And he's like, these are iron doors. Iron doors are going to be more secure. Your old doors, they're going to fall apart and tear apart. These are the good doors you want for the front of your house.
Yeah.
They're going to last.
He was like, they could end up in a museum hundreds of years from now, and people will be like, this was like Samad's door or whatever. Yeah,
exactly. He essentially... Again, the doors, man. It's a door salesman or repairman or whatever. And he has, I think this moment is, in my opinion, he's sort of, it's a dichotomy of like modernization versus tradition. Mm-hmm. These older men don't want the new doors. They want their old doors. Mm-hmm. They're used to it and they're happy with it. And this new guy is like, well, these are safer, secure doors and they'll last longer. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Is there something deeper to be like assessed from that? Do you think there's like something he's saying about the changing of times or something?
I think it has to do with the changing of times and also the idea of, again, perspective and treating each other with dignity. Like I think what's happening there is this guy who's middle-aged, you could make the argument that he's not treating his elders with the dignity that he should be, right?
Right.
Because he's like, you don't need, like, this is garbage. Like, you don't want blah, blah, blah. And he's basically taking a dump on their lifestyle, on the way that they lived and the way that their dads lived and all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so they're not going to want to listen to this guy, but they're like, well, I guess he's from the generation that runs things, so we have to listen. And it's kind of this weird thing where when you become, you're a child when you're born, right? Then you become an adult. And when you become an elderly, you almost become a child again, right?
Right.
So I think that's what's happening there is this, it's that transition between being an adult and becoming a child again. And I think it's shown very directly by the passage of time and the change in technology, where this guy's like, nope, you don't know what you're talking about. This is what's important. What's important is this iron door. Similar to how the adults are telling Mohammad, they're like, nope, you don't know what you're talking about. Your friend's book doesn't matter. What's important is your studies. It's that middle-aged generation is the one calling the shots. And the elderly and the young are the ones being left out.
Well, and so let me ask you something now. Knowing that the time that this was shot, and we don't need to get super political about it, but like it was filmed and produced in 1987. So you do have this film that's 8 years post-revolution. Things have changed, not even for 10 years. And you have these middle-aged people calling the shots. They're telling the older people what's best for them, and they're telling the younger kid to shut up and listen. And this middle-aged guy who's selling these doors is promising them security and safety in these longer-lasting doors to the front of their house. Iron doors. Iron doors that you can shut in the front of your house and they will last longer. I don't want to read too much more subtext into that, but there just seems to be a lot of like interesting parallels to what was going on with the generational gap with Iranians in the mid to late 80s. No?
That's very fascinating. I think that's an excellent analogy to make, whether it was intended or not. But I think that that's a really great way to use this film to almost explain to people who don't know the history of Iran kind of what was happening in the 70s and 80s. Especially because the revolution that happened in 79 was largely a revolution of students. So that same guy who's building these iron doors would have been of that generation.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of brought about the revolution. Whether that character was involved or not, we have no idea. But the representation of that generation, where you have those three generations in that scene. But yeah, and I love that the old guy is like indulging in the conversation with him, and he's like debating him, and he's like, well, like you need a door that's gonna last forever. He's like, my door has lasted my whole life. He's like, but it's gonna fall apart. He's like, whatever, I'll get another door. And he's like, no, but this iron one will last forever. He's like, why do I need a door that lasts forever? He's like, it could end up in a museum. He's like, why do I care if it's in a museum?
Well, and I was going to get to this when we get to favorite quotes, but I'll say it once now, and I'll say it again at favorite quotes. But when the old man who's leading Ahmed through the town at the end is showing up, and I made this door, and I made this window, and I made this door, his quote is, but now I watch them taking out these doors one by one and replacing them with iron doors. And no one asks what was wrong with the old doors. If they had some flaw, no one would have ever bought them. They say these iron doors last a lifetime. But how they calculate a lifetime, I don't know. That's kind of leading to exactly what you're saying. It's like, it's one of my favorite lines. And again, I'm going to probably just repeat it when we get to that section. But yeah, okay. I think that's pretty good for deeper analysis. Unless you have something else to add in terms of deep subtext before we move to critical reactions.
No, not much more. I think that for me, it's a lot of what the film is about comes back to, dignity and ageism and responsibility, and community is a big one, especially when this kid's trying to find this house. He's like, I need to do this because this is my friend. This is a member of my community. This is a member of my social circle. And he's like, I need to like get out there and help him. And he doesn't know where he's going. Yeah. He just runs away when his mom's like, you need to do your work, blah, 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 blah. And then he tries to reason with her. And then when he can't, he just makes a run for it. Yeah. And then when he gets to this town, he gets to the town and he looks around and he's like, oh, shoot, I have no idea where I'm going. And so he relies on the community to try to find a solution, to try to find where he is, how to get there. And again, when he's asking these middle-aged people, none of them help him. It's either other children or it's the elderly. Those are the only two groups that actually help him in the film. And again,
Yeah.
you can make the argument that the elderly, it's that philosophy of you're born a child who becomes an adult who becomes a child again.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I was just going to add that I really like everything this kid does is just a selfless act for his friend. Like there's no vanity, ego, selfishness. And at the end, doing the homework for him almost becomes this revolutionary act in the defiance of all these people who are just kind of looking out for themselves. He's looking out for someone else. And he seems to be the only person in the town who's doing that, which is, again, why he maybe gets the flower at the end. Critical reactions. I just have one thing I read that I really liked, if you'll allow me. American film critic and author Jonathan Rosenbaum in 2015 called Kiarostami the greatest living filmmaker and called the film, along with Through the Olive Trees and Life Goes On, which is the Coker trilogy, he called it sustained meditations on singular landscapes and the way ordinary people live in them. Obsessional quests that take on the contours of parables, concentrated inquiries that raise more questions than they answer, and comic as well as cosmic poems about dealing with personal and impersonal disaster. They're about making discoveries and cherishing what's in the world, including things that we can't understand. End quote. And I really like that description.
I think that guy's favorite book is the Thesaurus.
Yes,
Like
I don't disagree with that.
The amount of hyperbole in his assessment of these movies, I think, is insane. Especially when you're talking about a movie that's known for being a slice of life, simplistic film. And I'm not saying simplistic in a derogatory way. I'm saying simplistic in a way that's very beautiful. It's very humble.
No.
You know what I mean? So it's for this guy to come out and be like, you know, the philosophy behind this film and the impact that it has had, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like,
Well, it's kind of what we're doing.
I guess, but like, I think that we're having a more frank dialogue about it as opposed to... Even
I'm
just
saying,
to me, it's I take issue with the way that he words his point as opposed to the point itself. I would agree with his point. I agree with his point. I agree with what he's trying to say. I don't like the way that he's doing it.
And this is why we're good counterparts for this, because I really like the way he said it. And just, it's so writerly. And I, you know, as being the writer in the podcast of the two of us.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you're a writer as well, but being the solely a writer. Yeah, game recognized game is what I'm saying with this guy's critical analysis.
Hey, I feel it. I feel you.
Trivia time. I've got some fun facts to throw at you. Maybe you know some of them. Maybe you haven't.
Hit me.
But this film made Akira Kurosawa's top 100 films of all time list.
Whoa.
So Akira Kurosawa himself saw this film and was like, this is one of the best films I've ever seen.
That's awesome.
Babak Ahmedpour, who plays Ahmed, was considered potentially dead after the 1990 earthquake, which is what led to him, Abbas Kiarostami, making the second film, the documentary about trying to find him. But apparently he did not die in the earthquake, as a film journalist, Robert Osborne, said. He made movies afterwards. So this actor has gone on to become a filmmaker. I haven't even heard of any of his films, but this little boy apparently is not a little boy anymore and making films.
That I didn't know. I do know one thing that Kiarostami talks about in the Q&A at the Aga Khan, where someone in the audience is like, oh, when the first time I watched this movie, I was very young and I interpreted this film as being very intense. It caused me a lot of stress watching this film.
Yes.
Because I identified with this child and the stakes felt so high. He's like, but now rewatching it, it made me smile and laugh at numerous times. And he's like, do you ever get that watching your films? And he's like, I can never have that kind of reaction to watching my films because I know these people as people. But this time when I did watch it, the whole time I was thinking about the actor who plays the young boy, the main character. Yeah, Ahmed. And by the way, for our listeners, Ahmed and Mohammad are interchangeable. Mohammad is like a nickname for Ahmed. It's also a nickname for Mohammad, funny enough.
Yeah.
But he was mentioning that he had recently had a conversation with that kid. They had been reconnected. And there was a bunch of personal crises going on in his life. And that was what was being brought up to him. And he mentions, he's like, I don't want to get into what those crises are. It's none of your concern, but that's what was going through my mind. And that's why when the translator's translating his answer, she leaves that part out.
That's interesting. I didn't catch that part. Also in trivia, this film is ranked number 94 non-English speaking films in the critics poll conducted by the BBC in 2018. And as I mentioned before, it made BFI, the British Film Institute's it made the top 50 films you should see before you're 15.
Before you're 15 or before you're 50?
Before you're 15. They said, like, see this movie in your coming of age years.
What, like, child or teenager is looking up BFI's list of 50 movies to watch before you're 15?
The kind that will be influenced by a movie like this before they're 15.
I guess. Were you into that? Like, before I was watching, like, superhero movies. I don't know. I think I watched Terminator for the first time as a teenager. Like,
yeah, it took me a long time to have a growing appreciation for Iranian cinema. I definitely wasn't checking that out at like 12 or 13.
Yeah.
Okay, so best scene section.
Okay.
I mean, this is just, we discussed some of our favorite scenes.
Yeah.
What you can take it away.
My favorite scenes, one of them is the one where he's trying to talk to that group of people and they're all just kind of ignoring him, and he like keeps
the door salesman.
Yeah. That one. That's probably my number 3. Number 2 is when he's on the walk with the old man who's like, I built this door, I built that door. Yeah. And he's like, I actually know your dad. I built the door to your own house. He's like, I even built your father's crib when he was a baby.
Yeah.
And
he's obsessed with doors, man. I'm telling you.
Windows 3,
ready for my lame pun? It's adorable.
Love
Faran.
it. Love it.
There you get going.
And then tied for number 1 is the first time that you see him make a break for it to push there. And the music is playing, and he's like running, and you get like the iconic shot of him running up the trail,
zigzag.
And then and he runs through all these different locations, and each location is visually simple, so it's easy to track him, but different from shot to shot, so that each time he goes back and forth between the two towns, it's very clear to the audience. Okay, now he's on his way back. Now he's coming back to Pushta. Now he's going back to Koker. Now he's going back to Pushta, because the audience has seen those 3 or 4 establishing shots, and every time it's the same framing. And then the other scene that's tied for number 1, this is more of just like a specific shot than it is a scene. But when he first comes home from school and he goes in the room to get something, I think he's going to get the bottle for his mom, and you see it's one shot. He's framed right in the middle, and there's a window, and through that window you see his friends talking to him, being like, hey, come and play. And then there's a mirror in front of him as well, and you can see his face through the mirror. And so you get everything in this one shot. You get him coming in, you get this beautiful composition with him center framed and everything. You get the action that he's doing by like collecting the bottles. You see his friends in the window talking to him, and you see his face and his reaction in the mirror. And it's all in one shot. And I thought it was framed beautifully. And it's such a efficient way to show all the beats of that scene without having to do multiple setups.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's I remember that shot. Those are all good. I have a few, I have similar. I didn't do like a top 3, 2, 1, but for I have my favorite scenes. The opening scene in school, I just really like. And I very much like the door salesman scene, how much they're ignoring him. The final shot, in terms of just shots, I love that final shot of the flower that I mentioned. And, even that final scene before Ahmed shows up and you see Nematzadeh sitting there and he's like, I'm going to get in so much shit. I remember you just see this dread, and the teacher's checking everyone's homework one by one. He's like, I'm going to get expelled. And you just see this dread creeping up on him. He's like, I'm in deep shit. And then Ahmed shows up in the last minute with the notebook. I really like that.
Yeah.
And I think this is probably my number 1 scene. Is my favorite shot is the the scene with the old man walking with the young boy and pointing out all the doors and windows. But I will add also a very funny moment I like is when he finally decides he's going to go run out and give the book to his friend. Do you notice the joke that they put in there where he starts running, then he looks at what book he has and he realizes again he has the wrong book and he runs back to his notebook and switches books again.
That's so funny.
Yeah, it's such a funny little joke of like, he's like, you know what? I'm doing it. He's going to run out and like save his friends. And he starts running and then you see him check the book. And then he's like, oh, I have the wrong book. And he runs back to
That's
his
so funny.
bag and switches the books
even in
again.
class, when he finally gets there and gives him the book,
Again,
he gives him
switches
his own
again.
book. Instead,
Yeah.
You know, in a modern Iranian film, what would happen is either A, he gets to the class too late and the teacher has already asked him and he's like, oh, I don't have my book or whatever. And he's like, get out of my class, blah, 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 blah. And then as he leaves, like, Mohammad doesn't see him leave, but he like leaves, he's crying, he leaves. And then Mohammad comes and sits down and he's like, where is he? Where's my friend? And then the movie would just end there. That's like modern Iranian version.
Yeah.
Or when the teacher sees that he's like, this isn't your book, this is his book, then him kicking both of them out or something.
Yeah.
Like
that's the Asghar Farhadi.
Yeah. Either one of those two is the modern Iranian ending.
Yeah.
And then some sad music plays superimposed over the kid crying again because Kiarostami ripped another photo.
Yeah. Worst scenes. Do you have a least favorite scene? I mean, you don't have to have one, but
I have one. I'm not like particularly bothered by it. It's just the first old man that he approaches when he's asking, hey, do you know where my friend lives? It's the guy who's just chilling there smoking cigarettes. And he's like, no, I don't. Yeah. And then he leaves. You don't need that. Like, you already have so many obstacles for him and like people who distract him with side quests and whatever that one is unnecessary. And it feels like he's just trying to make the script longer to turn this into a feature film instead of a short film.
Right. Yeah. There's I have I mean, this, I think you disagree with me, but I just, in terms of like my least favorite scene is because of how much I don't like the grandpa sending him out on an errand to get cigarettes that he doesn't even need. And essentially he goes on to like discuss with his friend the value in beating your children and how it will make them better. It's just, it's one of those things that I get it for time and place, but it's just like, I'm like, it just makes me not like the grandpa at all. In a world of people being mean and not listening to him, even his family member doing it. Yeah. I'm just like, I don't like that scene. I mean, I still think it's a scene you should have in the film. It's just like, maybe that's the moment I go and like grab a glass of water or something, or a glass of wine. I'm just
that's why I like that scene, is because it shows the difference between their philosophies, where
I know
he's
I just
like,
feel for the kid.
I know, but you need that because it's that juxtaposition, right? There's my artsy word for the podcast, where you need that grandfather character to have that point of view on society, so that it makes you appreciate the main character so much more. That being said, I wouldn't be surprised if Kiarostami had the opposite intention there, where he actually agrees with the grandfather. Given some of the answers that he gives in the Q&A, I feel like he might actually agree with the grandfather's philosophy there, where he believes that, sometimes kids do just need to fall in line. And sometimes you do just need to beat them just so they know who's boss, or just so they know like what to do, blah, 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 blah. Which he also portrays that same quality in himself by ripping the poor kid's photo.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we'll get to that part when we talk about what's aged poorly, because it's some interesting stuff. But yes, I totally get you. I think he believes in, like as the director and writer and creator of that world, he probably slightly believes a little bit of every philosophy he's showing. Probably. Like he's not really leaning towards one side. He sort of probably kind of agrees with everyone to a certain extent, right? But that being said, that being my least favorite scene, it's followed immediately by the door salesman scene, which I like a lot. So there's that. Section I call "Damn, That's Poetry," where you just kind of, you have a favorite quote in the film, because this one I found at first hard because I don't think it's necessarily a quotable movie. Like Taste of Cherry, I think, has a lot of profoundly beautiful quotes. This is more like cinematic language, the beauty, and it's like a lot of quieter moments. Or when people are talking, it's like come here, can I show you this thing? Oh, no, I can't, I'm sick. Come, let me just show you. No, I can't, I'm sick. Just come for a second, I want to show you. No, I can't. It's a lot of lyrical, just back and forth, ping pong. But there is one quote I had, but I'll let you go first if you have one.
I've already said it like multiple times, but it's he only needs to be asked once, so he gets paid $12,000. I need to be asked twice, so I only get paid $6,000. And to me, it's summarized by the idea that conformity pays. And I think it's something that the grandfather is encouraging, but I think that in a lot of ways, whether it's intended or not, the film discourages that because it's like, if this boy does conform to what all these adults are telling him, this other kid is going to be screwed.
Yeah, totally. I agree with that. That's a good quote. I think my personal quote is the favorite quote. It was one I already mentioned, but it's that old man walking with the kid. I built this door. I built that window. And he goes, I made the door of your friend's house too. I made the window here too. 40 years ago, it hasn't changed one bit, but now I watch them taking out these doors one by one and replacing them with iron doors. And no one asks what is wrong with the old doors. If they had some flaw, no one would have ever bought them. They say these iron doors last a lifetime, but how they calculate a lifetime, I don't know. To me, that's my favorite quote. I really like it. It's beautiful. And again, it just harkens back to this idea of like modernization versus tradition and the changing of times. And I feel, again, Kiarostami has some obsession with doors that is beyond the just surface level. But okay, favorite performance. I feel like this one, for me, it's a no-brainer. It's Ahmed. Babak Ahmed, who plays him, is the best. I feel like for other films, we'll probably have a larger canon of choices in front of us, but I don't know. For me, it was the kid. Is it the same for you too?
Yeah, for me too. And I think part of it is because it seems like, and I know that Kiarostami says that there's obviously a script. I think that the kid doesn't necessarily know his lines verbatim, but he knows the crux of what he's supposed to be saying in the scene. And as a result, he kind of fumbles over what he says, and he's really mumbly. It's not as clear in the subtitles because the subtitles are very clear and direct. But when you listen to him in Farsi, he repeats himself a lot, or he says things kind of backwards, and it feels much more natural and much more real. And I think that's also reflective of his performance as an actor. I think that a lot of indie films try to do that naturalistic approach to dialogue where they'll get to a scene and they'll like get their actors to just kind of improv the dialogue a little bit. And there's some indie films that I've seen that do it terribly, and I just get so frustrated watching them. Sometimes it's done really well, and I think it's a testament to those actors. And in this case, this little boy does a phenomenal job at it.
Yeah, he's and even the kid who plays Mohammad Reza, the crying. I mean, I know the crying was manipulative and borderline emotional assault, or rather, it was emotional assault. But I feel like all the kids, just they feel so natural, in their performances, which is a testament to their acting, but as well as Kiarostami's directing.
Yeah.
Nitpicks and hot takes. Do you have any hot takes or nitpicks about the film that you're like, I don't like this part so much, or I don't think this part's great?
The kid crying thing is obviously one, but that's like a very meta nitpick. The other one I think you can probably lose about 20 minutes from the film.
Yeah. Just what, the interactions and running around?
Just in general, there's like moments where you kind of get, like even the scene where he's walking with the old man, which I said is one of my favorite scenes. I think you could cut it down a little bit. Like, I'm not saying make it like snappy and fast paced, but there's just a little bit of redundancy in some scenes. And I think that even in some of the side quests, there's some parts that you just don't need, or you can at least trim it a little. And I'm also saying this largely because I come from an editing background. Kiarostami also, here's the thing. I've said this to someone once before, and they were like, where did you hear that? And I can't find it. And I've been trying to find it for years. So if someone listening knows where this is from, please let me know. It's also certainly possible that I heard this from a personal friend of Kiarostami. But what I had heard was that because when he first was coming up, he wasn't very technically proficient in editing. he would let things run very long because he just
long
didn't
takes.
want to. Yeah, he just didn't want to deal with the hassle of having to cut something up too much, and it kind of became what he was known for. That paired with the fact that he prefers telling short films, but he's encouraged to tell longer format stuff. So he's often trying to find things to intentionally draw things out. I think that you could have gotten this down from an hour 20 to an hour, and it still would have felt just as much of a slice of life with very intentional pacing without it feeling too slow.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm okay with the runtime, but I hear like that's a really interesting thing you're saying about the editing and taking the long takes. I hadn't heard that, but maybe you can find your friend who knows Kiarostami and ask
I've been trying.
I don't really have any nitpicks or hot takes other than just that teacher comes in so angry, and I'm just like, dude, fucking chill. I get it, time and place. It's like it's a product of it, but
I love it. I actually
such
made
an
a point.
asshole.
I made a note when I came in. I was like, this principal is very accurate to a Persian father. I wrote, he also sounds a little more city educated, and the kids sound more like they're from this area. Also, all the kids genuinely look like they're from the north of Iran, which obviously they are, whereas the teacher character might be able to pass as being from somewhere else, which typically the teachers who would come and teach in these rural areas in the north were usually from the city. So he has a little bit more of a city accent, I find.
interesting. Like Tehran?
I wouldn't say Tehran. It would probably be like the capital city of some northern province. Like even
Right,
like
okay.
Sari or something. But
What's it's not a nitpick again, but a small kind of thing. Like, how does the dad not get a single line of dialogue in this film? Not one.
Yeah.
He's not there at the beginning, and then we see him at the end of the film. He's kind of like fiddling with the radio and just staring at his son. But like, still no dialogue.
yeah.
It's just an interesting choice creatively, I guess.
Yeah.
What aged poorly? I have two thoughts.
Okay.
One is the grandfather describing the importance of beating your child. It just doesn't age for a 2023 audience. Again, I know time, place, location, different. But yeah, it's just sort of, I feel like we've evolved from that a bit, or I hope rather.
I think that I would make a counter argument that is more relevant now than ever before because it's reflective of the older philosophy. Because this is an old man, right? And it's meant to show that he's different. So the fact that he has this philosophy, I think, is very fitting.
I'm not saying it's not accurate. I'm just like, ugh, it just makes me not like him that much.
Yeah. One other thing I just want to say about the old man.
Yeah.
He's also not saying, I beat my kid or my son should beat his son. He's saying that when he was a kid, his dad beat him.
Yes.
So even this
he
old
said he
man,
beat his son.
Does he?
Didn't he say he beat his son though?
No,
I don't know.
I thought he was telling the story about how his dad would beat him. That he was like, every day my dad would give me 1 rial.
Yeah.
But every 2 weeks he would give me 1 beating. And there would be times where he would forget to give me the rials, but there would never be a time where he would forget to give me a beating. And then he says, in my estimation, I think it's still a good thing to give your kid the occasional beating just so they're always kept in line. Right?
Yeah.
Which to me is kind of indicative of an older time, like a time that is no longer relevant, you know? And I think that that's kind of the counter scene to the scene with the other old man who makes the valid point about the door. And maybe the truth in it is, okay, some things from older generations, like beating your kids, you probably shouldn't do anymore. But maybe some things where you're like getting rid of these beautiful wooden doors, you should think twice about it, you know?
Right. Yeah, that's fair.
Things that age poorly to me, again, and I know that this is a hot take paired in with the what aged poorly. I think that some of that pacing, again, I think that some scenes linger a little too much.
Yeah.
And I think that if this movie was to come out today, I think absolutely people would be critical of it. But I think
Of the pacing.
But I think specifically because this is a Kiarostami film and we know that his pacing is like this, I don't think anyone would make the argument that, oh, it's too slow, blah, 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 which is why I think it's a hot take.
Yeah.
Paired with aged poorly.
Yeah. The one other thing I'll add for what aged poorly, and I'm not going to go too far into it, especially for our first podcast episode, but I'd say there's an argument to be made that Abbas Kiarostami has aged a little bit poorly in terms of societal. There's been growing concerns about his. I mean, first of all, the way you said, he directs his child actors and maybe emotionally manipulates them, but there's been like claims that he's stolen people's ideas and hasn't treated a lot of women in the industry properly. But that's, again, for another podcast entirely. But I'd say that there is a fair argument to be made that the director himself is kind of like, he got away with things in 1985 that if a director did today, they would be pretty much persona non grata in the film industry.
For sure. There's been, and you can Google it, like you could literally just type in like Kiarostami Me Too and things will come up.
Yeah.
So that's definitely out there. I'm sure that if he was around now, there would be more information available about that stuff, and it would be a way bigger concern than, unfortunately, it was at his time. At his time, these things were ignored, and they shouldn't have been. So, yeah, I think to your point, he has definitely aged poorly as a person. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, again, for the purpose of the podcast, it's important to separate the artist from the artist as a personal life and their personal things from the work that they've created. Because, I mean, the films he's made, I think are profoundly beautiful and impactful in Iranian culture.
Although, I don't know how much you can separate it, because even if you look at least his films that I've seen, women never have substantial parts in his film.
Right. No, that's a valid argument to be made. I don't, again, it's partially like a product of the 80s, though, man. You look at Hollywood, they were all like, these are all movies about how great men are. And women were often, for the most part, sort of like secondary or third to, male protagonists.
Yeah.
That's like a Hollywood thing. That's a film industry thing.
Yeah, and the movie's also set in the like first decade post-revolution Iran, and it's set in a village in Iran where even during times where women did have more freedom in the villages in Iran, they still didn't. Like these photos that you see online where women live very liberally and had a lot of freedoms in Iran, those are photos in the cities. Like if you went to the rural areas, they were oftentimes persecuted within the like local rule of law or whatever it is. So you could make the argument that, well, a female character couldn't have a big part in this kind of setting.
Yeah.
I don't know how true that is, but you can make that argument.
There was also a thing I'd read where one critic had said perhaps one of the reasons that these directors work a lot with children is it's a way to talk about censorship and morality placed on women. But instead, it's like a skirt around. Instead of talking about the morality and injustices against women, you could actually put the children in the center and be like, look at how these children are being ignored. Look at how these children are being told what to do and how to behave and morality and all that stuff. But really, it was their way of talking about women's rights and getting past the government, because like, oh, no, we're not talking about women's rights. Don't worry, Islamic regime. We're telling about children who are being told what to do and how to act. So there's an interesting thing. Yeah, like that, like they could have been, because Panahi does it too. In his films, like The White Balloon, where it's like they're children protagonists, but maybe they were trying to find a way to talk about women's rights, and this was the only way they could get these films made under the rules and regulations based on the Islamic government. I don't know. It's potential. It's a thesis.
That's really interesting. Very interesting thesis.
Yeah. Double feature lineup. What film would you think this would pair really nicely with if you went to a double feature billing in the theater?
I mean, I think the obvious answer is one of the other films in the Coker trilogy. So my real answer is that. if I was to give like an out there answer, I would say Samad Madrase Miravad, which is a film about basically Iranian Laurel and Hardy or Iranian Charlie Chaplin. And it's this villager in a rural area of Iran, but he's an adult. And all these other people in the movie, they're all adults, but they never had the opportunity to go to school because schools hadn't come to their village yet. And so now all these villagers who are adults have an opportunity to go to school, and the antics that happen are freaking hilarious. And I think that it would be a really interesting foil to this, where this movie is very serious. It's about children and, it's about, in my opinion, ageism and about community and all these things. To then watch the Samad film, I think is like a really hilarious lineup. And it also helps because one of them is slice of life. It's slower. So then to go into a comedy immediately after, I think kind of gives you a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I haven't seen Samad. We're going to do that probably for a future episode. But I actually went quite outside the box. I was thinking if you were going to screen this with a film and try to get a broader audience to see Iranian films, I was thinking non-Iranian films you'd pair it with. So I thought of Cinema Paradiso.
Okay.
Life is Beautiful. Jojo Rabbit. Or even Boyhood. Because just pairing them with films with other children lead protagonists, kind of dealing with really heavy adult dramatic content, but it's like through the perspective or the eyes of a child. I think could be like thematically and tonally, like picture this paired with like you see this and then you watch like Taika Waititi's Jojo Rabbit.
Yeah.
Like there could be some interesting, like you could draw some parallels.
That's a heavy day.
Yeah, it is a heavy day.
I would be emotionally exhausted. I love both of those movies, but watching those two back to back, I would be emotionally exhausted. But thematically, I totally understand it.
Let's, to make it lighter, we'll do Where's the Friend's House paired with Dude, Where's My Car? And then you have your double feature right there.
Movies that ask questions about people trying to find things.
Yeah, you could call the double billing Dude, Where's My Friend? Okay, can this be made into a Hollywood remake? Your thoughts?
I don't think Hollywood would ever make a movie based on this. If they did, they'd fatten it up with like a B and C plot, maybe throw in like a romance plot or like a backdrop of war or something. Stripped to its core, the most I could see is this being adapted into an episode of a TV show, the same way that Seven Samurai often gets done. Now it's more often adapted into episodes of shows, like recently it was adapted into an episode of The Mandalorian. You could totally have a side quest episode in The Mandalorian where there was like a mix-up of something and he's going around with Grogu trying to find somebody, and then he has to go back and forth between two planets, and then he finds this person and gives it to him. Or maybe it's like we follow Grogu for a whole episode and he's trying to find Mando. And it's all about the antics that he gets into going back and forth between these two planets.
The Ahmed Lorian.
Yeah.
Or that's pretty good.
The Mamadlorian or the...
Yeah. Mamadlorian. I think... I don't have any specifics, but I think it would be possible. Like, the one thing I would say would be interesting was like, what would Wes Anderson do if he had the script? Like, I would be kind of fascinated to see a Wes Anderson
that's
version
interesting.
of this. Or like, again, I said Jojo Rabbit. Like, what if Taika Waititi did this script?
That'd be
I
cool.
feel like it could be a version of a Hollywood remake that would invite interest, even though it's not necessary to make a Hollywood remake of this film.
That's really cool.
Okay, and then final thoughts and grades.
I don't have too much for final thoughts because like I shared all my thoughts on it for the most part. My overall grade, actually, why don't you give your final thoughts? Because I don't have final thoughts, and then we can both just give our grades.
Yeah, my final thoughts are just I think this is my third time watching the film, and it's the most I've ever loved it. Actually, really paying attention to it. I thought it's an excellent film in ways I hadn't really discovered. At the end, after this he goes on this entire journey, and he gets to the front door of the house, and then he kind of runs back. He's there. The old man has led him there, but it's now the wind is coming up, and it's nighttime, and it's dark, and it's like he kind of just. I couldn't figure out at first why he doesn't go in, but then the more I thought about it, like he's just a scared kid. Like he gets scared at the end, you could see he doesn't really want to walk back alone. He hears a dog barking and all this stuff. And after this entire journey, you go and you're just reminded that it's just a little kid. And I thought there's something really beautiful about that. And again, like it just really hit differently this third time watching it. And all the stuff about the doors that I believe is there, it made it really stand out. So I'd say it's an excellent film. And though it's not my favorite Kiarostami film, and that my favorite Kiarostami film will be for another episode down the road, it's up there in my top 5, maybe top 3. So I would give this like an A minus. Like
Okay.
it's an A, but probably like a low A.
Okay.
I'd surface around there. Yeah.
I feel like we're kind of around the same ballpark. I give it a B+.
That's fair. That's probably more accurate to what I should have given. But
I don't know. I feel like
go on.
A- is probably pretty solid too, especially given how all these different critical film lists are giving it like A+, and all this stuff. For me,
Yeah.
it's a little bit more of a B+. I feel like a little bit of the intrigue, like the cultural intrigue, isn't necessarily there for me because obviously we're born and raised in this culture. So when you strip that back, we're really just left with, okay, yeah, it's a slice of life, and we get a little bit more of the nostalgia aspect because it's a slice of life that we're very familiar with, right?
Right.
Especially my family, literally my dad's family is Azeri and my mom's family is Mazandarani. So this is like basically an amalgamation of the two, even linguistically. So for me, it definitely ends up being more of a B-.
Cool. Yeah. We're not too far off. I'm going to be curious to see where, as we go through other episodes, 10 episodes down the line, like how far apart, how often are we like, chasms apart from each other? Like I'll be excited for the day you give something an A+, and I've given it like a D- or something. That would be an interesting film to discuss. And I think for episode 2, we're very likely going to do the 1974 Iranian film The Deer by Masoud Kimiai. And, I mean, there'll be a lot to discuss there. I had never seen it, so watching it it'll be a first for me. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I think I might have seen bits and pieces of it as a kid, but I don't think I've ever seen it in its entirety. The name of our podcast is also relevant to that film, as well as an event that happened in Iranian history that's very important to modern Iranian history, but we can talk about that next episode.
Yeah, it's worth a Google, but we'll leave that for you. Faran, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to the listeners for listening. For Cinema Rex, this is Kaveh Mohebbi.
And I'm Faran Moradi.
Until next time, be umide didar.
Nice.
Music for Cinema Rex was written and performed by Sohail Satinjan.